Nathan Moreno. Welcome to Crash Course U.S. History. Today we are going to be covering the Great Depression and the New Deal. Let's get started with the stock market crash of 1929, which was also known as the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Great Crash. The first day was known as Black Thursday on October 24th, 1929. It was during the Roaring Twenties, the time period after World War I that was known for wealth and success. We saw many titans of industry fall. For example, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had dropped 24.8%, marking one of the worst declines in the U.S. history. This leads us to some of the causes of the Depression. One was the stock market crash that we just went over. It destroyed confidence of Wall Street markets and led to the Great Depression. The second one we're going to go over is bank failures. Some people panicked, causing bank runs as people desperately wanted to withdraw more money. And surviving institutions, unsure of the economic situation and concerned for their own survival, became unwilling to lend money, which led to less and less spending, which also inevitably hurt the economy. Another cause of the Great Depression, or reason as to why it led to the Great Depression, was the reduction in purchasing across the board. As we just went over with the bank runs, people wanted to spend less and less because the banks weren't being as friendly as they were. And with people's investments being worthless, their savings were either gone completely or diminished by a large amount. Credit tight to non-existent as well, and spending by consumers and companies alike ground to standstill. Another one we're going to go over is the American economic policy with Europe, because as the Great Depression tightened its grips around the Americans, the government had to act somehow. A number of American trading partners retaliated by imposing tariffs on the U.S. goods, and as a result, world trade fell by 2/3 between 1929 and 1934. Luckily, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Democratic Party member, created new legislations that would eventually help the hurt that the Great Depression had. The last topic we're going to go over is the drought conditions. The economic devastation of the Great Depression was made worse by environmental destruction. A years-long drought coupled with farming practices which did not use soil prevention, and also what could be called a dust bowl of massive dust storms choked towns, killing crops and livestock, sickening people. All of these were conditions of the drought. After that quick break, let's get back to some of the effects and long-lasting legacies that the Great Depression had. One example is Hooverville. Hooverville was a shanty town built during the Great Depression by the homeless in the United States. They were named after Herbert Hoover, who was the president of the United States during the onset of the Depression, and who was unfortunately widely blamed for it. And let's move over to some of the tariffs and acts that we saw created. The Hawley-Smoot Tariff of 1930 vowed to protect U.S. industry from overseas competitors. Also coupled to one of the causes of the Great Depression, which is the American economic policy with Europe. The measure imposed near tax record rates on a wide range of imported goods. Another example was the Bonus Army, a group of around 43,000 demonstrators made up of veterans, families, and affiliated groups gathered in Washington, D.C., demanding immediate bonus payments for wartime services to alleviate the economic hardship of the Great Depression. Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC, was a government corporation administered by the United States federal government between 1932 and 1957, provided financial support to state and local governments, and made loans to banks, railroads, mortgage associations, and other businesses. President Franklin Roosevelt, one of the saviors of the Great Depression, we'll call him, often referred to by his initials, FDR, was an American politician who served as the 32nd President of the United States from 1933 until his death in 1945. He was a Democrat from New York. He single-handedly worked extremely hard to repair the damages of the Great Depression and stock market crash of 1929. The New Deal was enacted by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The New Deal was a series of programs, public work projects, financial reforms, and regulations enacted by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the United States between 1933 and 1939. It responded to needs of relief, reform, and recovery from the Great Depression. Although the New Deal did not end the Depression, it was a success in restoring public confidence and creating new programs that brought relief to millions of Americans. 3 years of relentless economic hardship had taken their toll on the American psyche, though. Let's move over to brain trust. The brain trust, a term coined by James Kieran, a New York Times reporter, refers to the group of academic advisors that FDR gathered to assist him during the 1932 presidential campaign. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's 100 days was the first 100 days of FDR's presidency, which began on March 4th, 1933, the day he was inaugurated as the 32nd President of the United States. During this period, he presented a series of initiatives to Congress designed to counter the effects of the Great Depression. During FDR's time, the Emergency Banking Relief Act was also signed into law on March 9, 1933. These panicked actions made it harder to stabilize problem banks. To stem the tide, Roosevelt declared a national bank holiday on March 5, 1933, shuttering the nation's banks for several days, which was a major bonus towards all the banks because they needed that time off. Now let's talk about the first New Deal programs presented by FDR, let's talk about two in particular. Well, let's name all of them first. The NRA, the AAA, the TVA, TCC, FARA, PWA, FDIC. Let's talk about the FARA. The FARA gave economic aid. The Federal Emergency Relief Act of May 12, 1933 implemented President Roosevelt's first major initiative to combat the adverse economic and social defects of the Great Depression. And the AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Act Recovery, created in 1933, paid farmers for not planting crops in order to reduce surpluses, increasing demand for several major farm commodities, and raise prices. Now, after these New Deal programs, we saw the second rush of New Deal programs, which was the SSA, the WPA, the Wagner Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act. And for each New Deal program, there is a summary of the law, agency goals and achievements, and insurance and aid to mothers and children, and which had eventually created the Social Security Administration, or the SSA, which we are going to go over next. The Social Security Act was for relief, in a general statement. It was the cornerstone law of Franklin Roosevelt's second New Deal. The Social Security Act provided old age pensions and unemployment insurance, seeking to provide general welfare to the public and American citizens who had been affected by the Great Depression. Now let's talk about the Wagner Act, another second New Deal program. The National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, just helped workers by giving workers the right to unionize and bargain collectively, so it gave more rights to the workers, which was something that the workers desperately needed. The Keynesian economics, deficit spending. According to most economics, during recessions, the government can stimulate the economy by intentionally running a deficit. The deficit spending requested by John Keynes for overcoming crises is the monetary side of his economic theory. The Indian Reorganization Act, also known as Wheeler-Howard Act, in June 18, 1934, measure enacted by the U.S. Congress aiming to decrease federal control of American Indian affairs and increasing Indian self-government and responsibility. Through the revolving credit fund, many Indians improved their economic position. That was also great, but another great person that we need to mention other than FDR was FDR's Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins, who was an American sociologist and workers' rights advocate who had served as U.S. Secretary of Labor from 1933 to 1945, the longest serving in that position and the first woman appointed to the U.S. cabinet. She was a principal architect of the New Deal programs. Some finishing topics that we're going to go over about the Great Depression and the New Deal. One, let's start off with the Butler versus U.S. Supreme Court case. The United States versus Butler Supreme Court case, which took place in 1936, I believe, was a case in which the court held that the U.S. Congress's power to lay taxes is not limited only to the level necessary to carry out its other powers enumerated in the Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, but is the broad authority to tax and spend for the general welfare of the United States. The decision itself concerned whether the processing taxes instituted under the 1933 AAA were constitutional. Court packing, the Judicial Procedures Reform Bill of 1937, often referred to as court packing, was a legislative initiative proposed by FDR, again, to add more justices to the U.S. Supreme Court in order to obtain favorable rulings regarding the New Deal. And the court had ruled unconstitutional. And lastly, we're going to go over Dorothy Lange, an American documentary photographer and photojournalist, best known for her Depression work era and the Farm Security Administration, Lange's photograph influenced the development of documentary photography and humanized the consequences of the Great Depression. So she was very key in showing the deep effects of the Great Depression during the time period and the Reform time period. Lastly, we're just going to go over how the Great Depression era was very, very hurtful to the United States, both economically and psychologically. The Great Depression hurt the economy very bad. Banks didn't want to give out as much money, which cut out more and more spending. And thankfully, FDR came in and tried his best to save the day. So he has a long-lasting legacy of being the president that helped the Great Depression reforms. This has been Crash Course U.S. History. I am Nathan, and as always, see you next time.
Internal magnetic forces